They breached Sol and learned what Terran means, begins not with ships descending in fire, but with arrogance drifting silently across the edge of known space. The Karax Dominion, an empire swollen with centuries of unchecked conquest, slipped across the outer threshold of Sol like a serpent testing the warmth of a new den. Their cruisers glided through the heliopause in immaculate formation, hulls gleaming with boastful gold and crimson sigils that represented oppressed worlds forced to kneel before them. The Dominion's commanders gazed into the dark stretches ahead of them with the bored confidence of predators expecting only another weak civilization ready to be catalogued, conquered, and chained. Their sensors swept across the scattered detritus of mankind's ancient probes, voyagers, pioneers, relics drifting in endless night. How quaint, they muttered, how primitive, how beneath them. They did not yet understand that those tiny relics were the opening footnotes of a species that had spent millennia learning to survive against every possible force that tried to silence it, including itself. The moment the lead Karax vessel drifted past Neptune's orbit, the Sol system stirred. It was subtle at first, so subtle the Dominion dismissed it as background noise. Microscopic shifts in magnetospheres, faint power signatures emanating from distant, dormant constructs hidden in shadows beyond the ice giants. But the changes continued, cascading through the darkness in patterns too synchronized to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. Sol was waking up. Humanity's great defense lattice, built layer by layer across generations who knew the universe would eventually knock on their star's door with hostile intentions, had detected an intruder for the first time in its existence. And as the Dominion cruisers pushed deeper into the system, those sleeping guardians turned their attention toward the invaders with the cold, unblinking patience of machines that had been waiting for centuries. Still, the Karax remained smug in their certainty. They had conquered species far more advanced, or so they believed. They had broken the Shar Collective's gravity fleets, crushed the Voidborn fractals, and extinguished the flame of the Quillarian emissaries. A system belonging to a newcomer race, a species whose broadcast history revealed wars, poverty, political chaos, and endless inner conflict, seemed laughably easy. According to Dominion intelligence, humans were passionate but undisciplined, innovative but reckless, ambitious yet fractured. The Karax expected this mission to be a swift annexation. They imagined Terrans would panic the moment they detected an alien armada entering their home system. They believed humans would either attempt pathetic diplomacy or scatter in fear. It never occurred to them that a species forged on a world of storms, disasters, predators, and constant self-created threats might have evolved something far more formidable than fleet power, unyielding, instinctive defiance carved into their bones. The deeper the Dominion advanced, the thicker the silence grew, a silence unnatural for what should have been an unprotected system. No ships approached to warn them away. No transmissions requested their identity. No panicked calls spread across the vacuum begging for mercy. The Karax thought this was proof of human weakness, but it was the opposite. Humanity had learned long ago that when a predator enters your home, you say nothing. You watch, you measure, you prepare your strike. Across the black, thousands of dormant Terran defense constructs, emplaced across the outer system like forgotten monuments, activated in cascading waves. Power cells charged, targeting systems aligned, network AIs lit up with golden eyes. And still, the Karax did not recognize the danger. Their flagship broadcast celebratory messages back to the Dominion's core worlds, boasting of imminent victory. They mocked the primitive species whose home they were about to seize. But for the first time in the history of the Karax Empire, their arrogance placed them inside a star system that was not a battlefield, not a territory to conquer, but a fortress whose foundations ran all the way down to the sun's nuclear heart. Every Terran outpost, every relay drone, every stealth satellite, every hollowed asteroid filled with weapons hummed with a single, unified purpose: do not let them reach Earth. Humanity, fractured in politics and culture, disagreed on nearly everything, except that Sol must never fall. Every generation, every nation, every ideology had contributed something to the defenses the Karax now wandered into unaware, constructing layer after layer of protection out of fear, paranoia, foresight, and love for a fragile blue world that had birthed them. And so the first true war humanity would fight, not against itself, but together, began not with speeches or warnings, but with the soft awakening of machines seated across the dark. The Karax Dominion did not yet realize they had roused a slumbering giant. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they had just stepped into the jaws of something far older, far more patient, and far more relentless than they had ever faced: the Terran will to defend home. The Dominion's first taste of terror came not from a fleet, a broadcast, or a declaration, but from the darkness itself shifting against them. As the Karax vanguard pressed inward past the scattered bodies of the Kuiper Belt, the shadows they had dismissed as debris seemed to stretch, breathe, and blossom with mechanical life. What they had mistaken for ancient, broken Terran probes suddenly unfurled sleek metallic petals like predatory flowers waking from centuries of hibernation. Obsidian lenses glowed with thin red slits that tracked movement with unnerving precision, watching the Karax cruisers glide arrogantly through space that was no longer empty. The commander of the vanguard, Voref Halvak, scoffed at the sight. Automated drones, he thought, harmless relics from a species afraid of its own star. But even he paused when the nearest construct rotated with smooth, predatory intent, aligning perfectly with the lead cruiser's hull profile. It did not hesitate. It did not warn. It simply fired. The weapon was unlike anything the Dominion had cataloged, an impossibly narrow column of magnetograv energy that lanced silently across the void and struck the Karax ship's armor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cruiser folded inward like paper crushed in a giant's fist, collapsing into a molten bloom of metal shards that spun mindlessly into the black. Shock rippled through the Dominion formation. This was no stray defense drone. This was a sentinel built for one purpose: to kill whatever did not belong in Sol. More constructs activated, rising from the frozen surfaces of minor planets, drifting from behind the icy cliffs of long-forgotten dwarf worlds, emerging from the shimmering dust of the belt like ghosts made of steel. Determined to reassert control, Halvak ordered a counterstrike. The Dominion fleet unleashed its charged plasma volleys, filling the vacuum with blazing crescents of green fire. The drones, however, did not meet them head-on. Instead, they split apart with inhuman speed, moving through mathematically perfect trajectories that made the attacks useless. They repositioned in patterns resembling swarming predators, each one locking onto a separate target with cold, clinical efficiency. Moments later, the Terran Sentinels fired in synchronized arcs, and the second wave of Karax cruisers exploded into clouds of glowing debris. Panic began to seep into the edges of their once confident discipline. The Dominion had relied for centuries on superiority of numbers and technology, but here, in the outskirts of Sol, they were outmatched by constructs humanity had built long before interstellar travel was routine. As the Karax attempted to regroup, the battlefield itself fought against them. Gravitational disturbances rippled through the dark as Terran traps, hidden beneath the frozen surfaces, triggered in response to the invaders' mass signatures. Mines, disguised as drifting ice chunks, detonated with silent ferocity, releasing bursts of compressed dark energy shockwaves that tore Dominion shields apart like brittle glass. Swarms of nanoscale interceptors poured from the crust of Haumea and Sedna, each speck drifting like dust motes until they struck a hull, then burrowing inward and shredding vital systems with surgical brutality. Terrans had built nothing with half measures here. Everything was designed with the grim understanding that an invader needed to be stopped long before reaching the inner worlds. Still, the Karax commander refused to retreat. Their empire did not retreat. In their doctrine, retreat was a stain that could never be scrubbed clean. Halvak barked orders across the tactical grid, forcing his remaining ships into a tight spearhead formation that attempted to cut through the defensive gauntlet with raw brute strength. Every Dominion vessel powered its shields to maximum, engines burning at furious capacity as they accelerated toward the orbit of Saturn. The fleet left behind a glowing trail of debris, plasma exhaust, and dying sparks of shattered pride, pushing forward not because they believed victory was certain, but because withdrawing would mean execution by their own leadership. The Karax Empire never tolerated weakness, and now, caught between pride and annihilation, the vanguard barreled directly into humanity's second line of defense. As they approached Saturn, their long-range scanners picked up conflicting data. Unusual energy signatures emanating from the planet's icy rings, large heat blooms pulsing in patterns far too regular to be natural. Some Karax officers insisted it was a trap. Others claimed it must be a malfunction in their scanners caused by earlier damage. But Halvak, desperate to salvage glory, ignored them all. The Dominion had always crushed systems whose defenders fought back. It was inconceivable that humans, the species they mocked as chaotic and technologically inferior, could maintain such an impenetrable outer defense. He told himself the drones were anomalies, relics of an ancient era, the traps mere coincidence, the losses temporary setbacks. He clung to arrogance like a lifeline, refusing to accept the truth forming around him like invisible chains. These defenses were not accidents. They were coordinated. They were intentional. They were waiting for him. What the Karax did not know, what they could not understand yet, was that they had not met humanity's true strength. They had only brushed the fingertips of it. The drones in the Kuiper Belt were the outermost echoes of a species whose survival instincts had been honed across eras of catastrophe. And as the Dominion limped toward Saturn, rattled and humiliated, they carried with them the seeds of a realization that would soon bloom into dread. Terrans had not merely built weapons, they had built a graveyard for anyone foolish enough to trespass. By the time the battered remnants of the Dominion vanguard reached Saturn, the once proud Karax formations no longer resembled the precision-cut spearhead that had pierced Saul's edge with arrogant grace. Their cruisers drifted in uneven lines, hulls scarred and gouged from the relentless onslaught of Terran sentinels. Command systems flickered in and out as scrambled crew members fought to maintain cohesion. Engine trails wavered like dying breaths against the suffocating darkness of the void. But still, they pressed on, driven by a doctrine that demanded victory, or death delivered by their own rulers. It was that desperation, sharpened into fanatic obedience, that pushed them forward into the orbit of a world they expected to be serene, harmless, a simple midpoint toward the softer planets. They did not know Saturn was waiting for them like a titan carved from myth. At first, the view was breathtaking, even to the hardened eyes of the Dominion. Saturn's rings stretched across the black like shimmering ribbons dusted with frost, glowing softly beneath the distant sunlight. The Karax, a species born on a world of volcanic plains and choking red storms, had never encountered beauty quite like this. For a fleeting moment, even the prideful officers aboard the Pride of Vokran felt a twinge of awe. Yet beneath that radiance lurked something too precise, too structured, too symmetrical to be entirely natural. The energy signatures detected earlier had intensified. Strange rhythmic pulses emanated from across the rings, echoing through the Dominion's calibration systems with a pattern that felt almost alive. Halvak dismissed the readings as after-effects of the battle, interference from their own damaged scanners. But the scans were not wrong, and Saturn was not passive. Without warning, the rings moved. At first it was subtle, a quiver, a ripple, a shiver running through the countless shards of ice and stone. Then the shift grew unmistakable. Vast arcs of the ring system began to rotate independently, sections separating and rearranging like pieces of an enormous celestial machine. The commanders stared in disbelief as gaps opened and new structures rose from beneath the glittering mantle. Antimatter harvesters, shielded for centuries within the frozen debris, emerged with long, unfolding arms of hardened alloy glowing from internal heat. They pulsed with sudden life, drawing power from reactors buried deep within the ring strata. The beautiful illusion of a natural wonder dissolved instantly, replaced by the monstrous truth. Saturn's rings were not rings at all. They were camouflage for the largest antimatter energy lattice humanity had ever constructed. And now it was fully awake. Before the Dominion could process what they were witnessing, the rings erupted. Blinding waves of plasma and antimatter discharge burst outward in spiraling arcs, turning Saturn into a luminous storm of weaponized fury. One Dominion cruiser was vaporized instantly, its hull annihilated in a white flash so absolute that not even debris remained. Another vessel tried to evade, engines screaming as it rolled hard to starboard, but the lattice fired again, slicing through its shields like wet parchment and gutting its core. Explosions rippled across the fleet as ship after ship was torn apart, their deaths silent in the vacuum, but deafening across the Carrack's comm channels. What stunned them most was the precision. Terran weapons didn't fire randomly. They chose targets with chilling clarity, picking off ships in a pattern that mirrored a hunter isolating the weakest prey first. The Dominion's shield lattices, once their pride, failed instantly under the magnitude of Terran firepower. The Pride of Vokran, the flagship, attempted to deploy its advanced refractive barrier, a technology the Carracks believed unmatched in the galaxy. But when the Terran plasma struck it, the barrier collapsed like a bubble touched by a needle, leaving the flagship exposed and trembling under the impact. Across the Dominion fleet, panic became too large to contain. Officers screamed that the ring system was alive. Others insisted humans could not possibly have built something so enormous, so powerful, so grotesquely efficient. And yet, there it was. The Carracks were not fighting a planetary civilization with scattered outposts. They were facing an entire star system engineered into layers of death. The realization struck them harder than the weapons firing from Saturn. Humanity had expected this. Humanity had planned for this. Humanity had poured centuries of fear, genius, and stubborn refusal to die into this hellish gauntlet, preparing for the day someone would dare to challenge their home. But the lattice was only the beginning. As more ships fell, additional structures rose from the ring fields. Dart-shaped drones, mirrored constructs, and colossal weaponized pylons that aligned themselves in perfect geometric arrays. Each array channeled its energy into a focused beam, converging into a single point that burned hotter than a star's surface. The Carracks officers watched in horrified wonder as the impossible occurred. Saturn's rings became a synchronized firing grid, a coordinated planetary-scale cannon aimed directly at the heart of the Dominion formation.
Halvak issued frantic orders to retreat, to scatter, to dive toward the shadow of the gas giant in hopes of breaking line of sight, but it was too late. The Terran grid fired. A beam of condensed annihilation streaked across the void, hitting the center of the Dominion's formation and erasing an entire cluster of warships in one obliterating instant. The shockwave shattered what remained of their cohesion. Ships broke ranks, engines flaring as terrified crews attempted to flee.
The once mighty vanguard devolved into chaos, each captain abandoning doctrine and hierarchy as survival instinct overrode their imperial conditioning. And still, Saturn fired, again and again and again. Every strike another reminder, nothing in Sol was natural, nothing was unprotected, nothing was left to chance. Humanity had taken beauty and turned it into a weapon. They had turned a gas giant into a fortress. They had turned a wonder of the cosmos into a graveyard. And the Karak's Dominion, so smug in their superiority, realized that they had not stumbled upon a system unprepared for war. They had wandered into the second layer of humanity's wrath, and there were still many layers left to come. The Dominion's surviving ships limped out of Saturn's killing field like wounded animals fleeing a predator they never believed could exist. Their hulls were scarred with molten streaks where antimatter lances had grazed them, their shields flickering like dying embers, their engines coughing out desperate spurts of thrust just to maintain formation. What had once been a proud armada of conquest was now a scattered procession of crippled vessels, haunted by the memory of a celestial wonder transforming into a death machine. The Karaks had entered Sol expecting glory. Instead, they carried a dread so heavy it weighed down every frequency of their comms. But the cruelty of their doctrine ensured that none dared speak the truth aloud. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was death. And so they staggered toward the next world in their doomed path, Mars. To the Karaks, Mars appeared deceptively barren at first glance, a world of rusted deserts, frozen poles, and storms that sculpted dunes taller than mountain ranges. Their scans detected no city lights, no orbital rings, no megastructures shimmering in elegant orbit. Compared to the monstrous power hidden in Saturn's rings and the brutal gauntlet of the Kuiper Belt, the red planet seemed almost peaceful. But as their battered fleet drifted closer, they noticed something strange. Mars was too quiet. No electronic signals leaked from its thin atmosphere, no civilian traffic, no orbital construction debris, no signs of settlement. It was as though the world had been abandoned long ago. Halvak dared to hope. Perhaps humanity had focused all its resources on the outer system, leaving the inner planets soft and vulnerable. Perhaps here the Dominion could regain momentum. But as the reddish glow of the planet filled their viewports, dust storms hundreds of kilometers wide began to churn unnaturally. They rose not in swirling organic spirals, but in structured, geometric patterns, shaking loose massive shapes half buried beneath the dunes. The sandstorms didn't obscure, they revealed. Colossal silhouettes emerged from the rouge haze, each one rising higher and higher, towering metallic monoliths that clawed their way into view like ancient titans waking from millennia of slumber. Their surfaces were carved with worn symbols of Earth nations that had once stood divided: eagles, stars, lions, crescents, dragons, and sigils older than Sol's first satellites. These war platforms, kilometers tall, stood not as monuments to division, but as proof that humanity had welded its fractured past into a unified war machine. One by one, they ignited thrusters buried beneath centuries of dust and ascended into the sky with the heavy inevitability of judgment rising. The Dominion panicked. Mars was not abandoned. Mars was armed. The war platforms didn't drift aimlessly. They moved with synchronized precision, each one selecting a vector that boxed the Dominion fleet into a tightening kill radius. Their sensor arrays scanned the Karax ships with chilling thoroughness, reading hull composition, engine damage, shield frequency, and heat signatures. Humanity's voice still did not greet them. No threats, no warnings, no negotiations. The only answer Mars gave was silence. An oppressive, deliberate silence that told the Dominion they were not worth speaking to. They had trespassed. They had slaughtered. They had tried to invade humanity's cradle. For that, they would not be reasoned with. They would be erased. In desperation, Halvok ordered full broadcast across all channels. His voice trembled as he attempted to invoke the Dominion's diplomatic authority. He promised resource exchange, non-interference treaties, tribute, anything that could stall their destruction. His words echoed across the void unanswered. Then he tried threats, invoking the might of the Dominion's core armadas, insisting humanity would face retribution if they continued their assault. But everyone on his bridge could feel the truth seeping into their bones. Humanity was not afraid. Not of retaliation, not of extinction, not of anything the Dominion could bring. The Terrans had built their defenses for the end of everything. Invaders, rogue AIs, solar storms, extinction-level events. And the Karax were just another scenario humanity had calmly prepared to handle. The war platforms opened fire. There was no flash, no beam, no dramatic spectacle. Instead, the sky became a storm of kinetic slugs accelerated to a fraction of light speed. Each slug was a solid tungsten rod the size of a transport shuttle, launched with such incredible force that they punched through Dominion hulls and exited the other side without even slowing. Ships ruptured silently, gutted by invisible fangs, before erupting into silent blossoms of flame. A single volley wiped out a third of the surviving ships. Another volley shredded escape pods attempting to launch. Another gutted their medical barge. And still the platforms fired, relentless, mechanical, cold. The Karax attempted evasive maneuvers, but the projectiles were too fast to track. They attempted to return fire, but nothing. Plasma, gravitons, ion bursts could dent the massive Terran platforms. Their armor was old, battered, patched together with repairs from generations long gone, but still they stood tall, bearing the weight of humanity's fury. The Karax flagship tried to deploy a jamming field, but the platforms adapted instantly, recalibrating trajectories in real time. Every attempt at resistance only revealed another layer of the Terran war machine's terrifying adaptability. For the first time in centuries, the Karax Dominion saw themselves not as conquerors, but as prey. Prey trapped in the jaws of something ancient and relentless. Prey hunted by a species whose entire history was built on surviving impossible odds. Prey being punished not by a military, but by an entire planet forged into a sentinel of vengeance. Mars showed them what humanity truly was when unified, when threatened, when cornered. Not fragile, not disorganized, not primitive. But a civilization that had turned its past wounds into weapons, its scars into shields, and its planets into executioners. And as the Dominion fled Mars' orbit with barely a handful of ships remaining, they did not flee with pride, or purpose, or imperial resolve. They fled with a single, soul-crushing truth echoing in every heart. Humanity had not even broken a sweat. The full wrath of Terrans had yet to come. They called it the Hour of Reckoning, though no Terran ever officially named it that. Names were for historians, and humanity had no time for historians in the minutes that followed the Arcori retreat. Sol burned with the glow of a star still cooling from a forced awakening. The quantum shields shimmered like broken glass knitting itself back together. And the fleet, our fleet, the resurrected, beaten but unbroken Terran Defense Armada, reassembled in a slow, silent arc around Earth. From orbit, human space looked wounded but alive, like a fighter spitting blood and daring the enemy to step back into the ring. And across every bandwidth, every military channel, every whisper net, one truth took shape like a mantra. They had breached Sol, and the galaxy had watched us rise to meet them. But the war was not over. The Arcori were retreating in disarray, leaving behind drifting wreckage and failing bioships. But retreat was not surrender, and every Terran knew it. Humanity had fought too many wars, lost too many worlds, and clawed too hard for survival to assume the enemy's back was turned in anything but strategy. So, as the last of the hostile signals flickered out of the inner system, a heavier silence settled. Not relief, but calculation. Not victory, but the tension before the next strike. Earth's skies filled with re-entry streaks as dropships returned survivors to the surface. Soldiers limping out on shattered armor. Engineers dragging crates of scorched equipment. Medics carrying the weight of both the living and the dead. Cities flickered back to life one district at a time. Solar farms rotated again. Orbital elevators resumed hums of motion. Humanity breathed, but only through clenched teeth. Admiral Reyes stood at the bridge of the TDS Vengeance, staring at the tactical map still crawling with afterimages of the battle. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her posture rigid, but her eyes carried a fury that even victory couldn't temper. She watched the distant coordinates where the Arcori fleet had vanished into slipspace, leaving behind a disturbance like a wound torn into space-time. The enemy hadn't expected resistance, not real resistance. They had thought Sol would be a tomb, its guardians scattered and broken, but they had found Terrans waiting like wolves in tall grass. Still, the Arcori had resources that stretched beyond empires. They were ancient, patient, calculating. This was only their first blow, and the Admiral knew it. "Signal High Command," she ordered, her voice steady. "Prepare counteroffensive protocols. Raise the auxiliaries. Begin reconstruction on lines 1 through 12. And ready the expeditionary fleets. Every available hull." Officers snapped to attention, their faces pale, their uniforms torn and soot-stained, yet their eyes shone with the same fire spreading across the system. They all understood the subtext. Humanity wasn't going to wait for the next invasion. Sol had endured being prey long enough. Across Earth, the news spread like a shockwave. Some people cheered from rooftops, screaming at the sky in cathartic, defiant triumph. Others collapsed in tears, overwhelmed by the weight of surviving a battle that should have ended them. In the underground bunkers beneath New Geneva, children drew pictures of Terran warships defeating monstrous aliens, their imaginations unable to grasp the enormity of what had transpired, but instinctively understanding the pride. In Luna's regolith caverns, miners gathered around holoscreens watching the footage of Arcori ships burning in Sol's light, whispering, "They'll think twice before coming back." And aboard the Martian domes, crowds stood in silence, gazing upward as Terran destroyers glided overhead like guardians reforged in the storm. For the first time in generations, the colonies felt united, not as scattered outposts, but as a single people under a single banner, Terran. But pride was not enough. Humanity had learned its lessons well over centuries of conflict. Every survivor knew the Arcori would regroup. They would heal, they would adapt, and they would come again, armed with new strategies and sharper claws. Which meant the Terrans had to move faster, strike harder, evolve quicker than any species that had ever crawled across the stars. Deep beneath the ice crust of Europa, black-budget labs hummed to life as scientists activated forbidden prototypes. Gravity lens railguns, star-lance surges, bioreactive armor grown from engineered microflora. In the asteroid belts, shipyards retool assembly lines to build dreadnoughts at triple pace. And in Earth's orbit, the forge ring, long dormant, flared with golden light as nanofactories awakened, weaving hulls from alloys that hadn't existed a week earlier. And amid all of this motion, this rebirth, humanity sent a message. Not words, not diplomatic signals, not threats in the usual sense. Instead, the Vengeance transmitted a single data packet into the void, compressed into a tight beam pulse aimed at the coordinates where the Arcori fleet had vanished. It contained no translation, no introduction, no warning. Only footage, raw, unedited, brutal, of Terran ships tearing through the Arcori armada, of Marines boarding bioships and emerging soaked in alien ichor, of orbital defense grids igniting the darkness with the fury of a star's heart. And at the end of the message, a final image, Earth rising behind a wall of Terran warships, carved with a simple caption in 1,000 languages. This is what Terran means. Whether the Arcori understood or not didn't matter. The galaxy would. The message wasn't a threat, it was a declaration. Humanity had stood at the edge of extinction, looked its executioners in the eye, and bared its teeth. And now, the predator in the dark, the one the galaxy had forgotten, dismissed, underestimated, was awake again. Sol was no longer merely defended, it was armed, vengeful, and watching. Those who sought to challenge the Terrans would not merely face soldiers, they would face a species that had been forged in extinction events, tempered in chaos, and reborn in fire. And as the fleets prepared to depart, ready to chase the Arcori into the farthest corners of known space, one truth rang throughout human space like a war drum. They breached Sol, and now humanity was coming for them.